All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. Got chapter 28, The Crisis of the Imperial Order, 1900 to 1929. We'll be looking at section 1, Origins of the Crisis in Europe and the Middle East. So here, the Imperial Order, let me get a different color here, is mostly referring to that era of imperialism, which dominated the globe roughly from 1800 to 1914. It is where a handful of industrial nations more or less took over the rest of the world. 85% of the global territory lay in the hands of these, 10, 15 countries or so. The crisis that this chapter is referring to, well, the crisis here in this section, I should say, section 1, is World War I, which is a war unlike any war that the globe had ever experienced. It didn't get this title, World War I, until there was a Second World War. At the time, it was simply referred to as the Great War, and it was so brutal and so devastating that many believed at the time that it would be impossible to have another war like it. The origins of this crisis, though, is what we're going to talk about specifically in this section. When we look at the outbreak of the First World War, we can point to a number of different factors that contributed to it. One, we would say, was the Ottoman Empire and its weakness. It was referred to or called the sick man of Europe. So this was the nickname for the weakening I think that's spelled correctly, Ottoman Empire. And we've talked about the Ottoman Empire already. And as the Ottoman Empire grew more and more weaker, it, on the one hand, left what we might call a power vacuum. That is, somebody looking to fill where the Ottomans had ruled previously, and just general instability. We might say uncertainty. One of the things that contributed to the failing Ottoman state, as we learned in some other sections, was nationalism. Right, specifically nationalism from Eastern European groups, such as some of these. So, for example, from 1900, really all the way up until 1914, Macedonia, Bosnia, Crete, Albania, Libya, all these territories broke away from the Ottomans. And conflicts with Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece, again, all Eastern European nations, again, kind of harnessing a Eastern European or Slavic nationalism, pushed the Ottomans out of Europe. The Ottomans, who had gotten as far as Vienna, Austria, in the 1600s, now by the 1900s, were more or less completely kicked out of Europe. So pushed Ottomans out of Europe. And so the question was, well, where the Ottomans used to rule, like Macedonia and Bosnia and Crete and Serbia and Romania, the question was, well, who's going to rule them now and what type of governing system that there was going to be. The Ottoman state recognized that the weakening of the empire was something that needed to be attended to. And so a group called the Young Turks, we might say this is a group of Ottoman reformers. Certainly wanted to save the Ottoman Empire. And they were able to, at the very least, maybe not seize complete control or power, but at least influence the state to make some changes. One was to readopt the constitution. Remember that the Ottoman ruler was the Sultan, and that during the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire had previously the Ottoman Empire had previously enacted a constitution, but that was mostly ignored by the Sultan, and the Sultan continued to rule as somewhat of an absolute ruler. With the reintroduction of this constitution, the Sultan was dramatically limited in power. And one thing the Ottomans, or the Young Turks, I should say, wanted to do was to use nationalism in their favor. So the Ottomans also went through a process of what we might call Turkification. So in this case, nationalism became synonymous with, the Turkish language, the Turkish culture. And that meant at the same time to really crack down on non-Turkish minority groups. Right, that is to no longer be the multi-ethnic, multilingual empire that it was for a very long time, but instead follow the model by, the Japanese, follow the model by the Germans, follow the model by the Italians, and create a state in which there's a nation of people. A nation, recall, are people who share similar ideas, languages mostly, culture, and kind of build a much stronger state based off of that. So, and also some of these other reforms came in with, adopting European style, militaries and technologies. And, there were efforts to try and change really on the verge of what the Ottoman is on, and that's, really collapse. So that led to a lot of instability in the region. And in fact, the origins of World War I have to do with, some of these territories that had previously been under Ottoman rule. When we look at some of the other long-term causes, we can summarize them as mania. This is a helpful little acronym in trying to recall exactly what caused World War I. So mania stands for militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and then the very last A refers to the short-term cause. So we might say long-term, short-term. And the last A refers to the assassination, which is kind of like the short term, or we might say the spark that set everything off. So some of these things we had actually touched upon in previous chapters, but leading up to 1914, which was the year that World War I broke out, all nations more or less spent more money on their militaries. This was especially true in the case of the German Navy. Recall Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted Germany to have a place in the sun. That was to compete with Great Britain in terms of imperial possessions, right? So we might say in terms of imperialism, competition among industrial powers. And the one that, again, is kind of upsetting the balance of power here is Germany. Again, a rather new country, very industrial, very technologically advanced, very powerful army especially. And, it's their ascendants, German ascendants, and Ottoman decline that are kind of the two ingredients that create this recipe of instability. Increasingly, nations sought out alliances with other powers. So, for example, in the years leading up to World War I, the Triple Alliance consisted of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Another alliance, the Triple Entente, between Russia, Britain, and France, and also Serbia. So there is a Russian-Serbian connection, or at least a Russian-Serbian alliance, and this has to do a lot with Slavic nationalism. The Russians believed to be, in a lot of cases, kind of like the protectors of all Slavic people, including those who lived beyond their borders. The Triple Entente, though, was formerly only Russia, Britain, and France. The reason I mentioned Serbia is that when looking at the First World War, it actually starts off as a conflict between this nation, Austria-Hungary, part of the Triple Alliance, and Serbia, which is somewhat connected to the Triple Entente via Russia. Nationalism, again, we talked about nationalism previously. Nationalism is primarily what motivates millions of people to go off and fight and die for their country. So we might say motivation to fight and die. This idea of nationalism has to be, powerful enough that people are willing to sacrifice their own lives, on behalf of their country, and their countrymen and their nation. And this is true for more or less all participants involved. It's a little bit more intense in other areas as well. But it's also a willingness by, specifically some of the nationalism in the former Ottoman Empire to try and reassert its independence. And lastly, the spark that kind of sets it all off. So, these things, militarism, alliances, nationalism, and imperialism, that kind of creates this recipe that is just ready to explode. The spark that sets it off is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was the Austrian. His title was Archduke, but he was the heir to the throne. So this guy was next in line to be the Emperor of Austria. And he was assassinated by Serbian nationalists, namely Gavrilo. Let's see, Gavrilo. I don't know if there's one L or two L's. Princip. And the reason why this Serbian nationalist group assassinated the Archduke was because in Austria, or Austria-Hungary, there were a lot of Eastern Europeans living there. And the Austrians weren't Slavic in their nationalism. They were more German. They used the Latin alphabet. They were more likely to be Catholic, whereas most Serbians use the Greek Orthodox alphabet and tended to be more Orthodox Christians. And so, this was a way of trying to create an independent Slavic state free from Austrian rule. The subsequent events eventually led to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia, and that was the first declaration of war. But once that declaration was made, it became all the more complicated because of how these nations were tied to one another via these alliance systems. So the first nation to really act or to mobilize, and to mobilize means to essentially get ready to fight. It means to move troops and supplies. And, given the technology of that era, once a nation mobilized, it was really difficult to stop. It was a process that took place that if it was interrupted, the mobilization would not follow through. So once the call was made to mobilize, once the call was made to move troops towards your border, to defend or attack, to move supplies, to get everything ready, that process couldn't be undone. And Austria's declaration of war on Serbia caused Russia to mobilize. We go back to our alliance system here. Caused Russia to mobilize. Once Russia mobilized, then Germany was forced to mobilize to protect its ally. France was then forced to mobilize as well. And so once all these nations pretty much got ready to move their armies, it more or less made, in some cases, conflict inevitable. I will say when it comes to British involvement, though, so we'll say Britain, Britain's war was because Germany's attack on Belgium. So Germany, in attacking France, went through the country of Belgium, which was a neutral power at the time, and that eventually got Great Britain involved. So that puts Great Britain into the war. Italy, on the other hand, decided that this was not a war that would serve their best interests, and so the Italians stayed out of it, right? They didn't honor their agreement. But just like that, you had Germany and Austria at war with Russia, Britain, and France, and this all transpired over the summer of 1914. So just like that, World War I had started. So we got a little bit of a map here to kind of understand where some of these empires are located, probably the notable ones to certainly know. In the side of the Central Powers, they're called the Central Powers because they're on the side fighting primarily in the center of Europe. There is Germany as part of the Central Powers, Austria-Hungary, who of course we know for declaring war on Serbia, and eventually the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire came on the side of the Central Powers in an effort to try to get back at their rival, which was Russia, to try to gain at Russia's expense. On the side of what we're going to call the Allies, or sometimes called the Entente, was France, Great Britain, and Russia, right? Those are the big major powers. A little bit later on in the conflict, it would also include Italy, which actually switched sides during the conflict. And of course, two other nations to take note of that we'll talk about in another section. Later on, the United States in 1917, and also later on, Japan would be on the side of the Allies.